The British political establishment is currently gaslighting the wider society by claiming that radical Muslims are threatening the very fabric of British democracy.
This House appears cowed by threats of violence and intimidation. The Mother of Parliaments appears weakened and diminished as a result. We have allowed our streets to be dominated by Islamist extremists.
So the recent events around Parliament wasn't the political establishment attempting to stifle the calls for an immediate ceasefire. No, it's because the Muslim mob threatens Parliament, its MPs, and the very democracy Britain supposedly stands upon.
A baying mob threatening murder, forcing the scrapping of a vote in Westminster, the mother of all parliaments, and the home of our representative democracy. What a time to be alive.
Look, this is important for us to understand, and by the end of this video we will clearly see the pro-Zionist agenda and their attempt to stifle debate and criticism of their support, their complicit support in a plausible genocide that Israel is committing. And in order to get away with these crimes of supporting Israel's genocide, they've deflected the criticism onto the Muslims. And it's not the far right or your Tim Pot activist that radicalizes non-Muslims against Muslims in this country. No, it's mainstream politicians supported by the mainstream media. And this results in more attacks against Muslims, particularly our sisters who wear the visible symbol of Islam. Therefore, it's important to understand what's going on, the politics around this, in order to expose it and expose it to wider society so that they are not played by the political establishment. So what happened in Parliament? The Scottish National Party wanted to bring forward a motion to vote upon a ceasefire. The wording of that motion was not only for a call for an immediate ceasefire, but also calling the actions of Israel a war crime. And according to a long-standing parliamentary protocol, there are certain days of the year in which minor parties like the SNP can bring forward a motion to be voted on by the MPs in Parliament. The other days are generally split between the party in power, which is the Conservatives, also known as the Tories, and the main opposition, Labour. However, the Speaker of the House decided to change the order. Instead of allowing the SNP's motion to be voted first, he actually decided to make the Labour's motion go first, the main political party in opposition and who are seen likely to be winning the next general election. So why was this significant of the change of order? Because Labour's motion had these carefully crafted words. Please listen. A ceasefire that lasts and is observed by all sides, noting that Israel cannot be expected to cease fighting if Hamas continues with violence, and that Israelis have the right to the assurance that the horror of the 7th of October 2023 cannot happen again. It's clever language, which doesn't mean immediate ceasefire. It's basically saying a ceasefire based on conditions. For example, the assurance that the horror of the 7th of October attacks cannot happen again. Israel could easily say, we back this decision because we also want a lasting ceasefire, so they can use the excuse to continue its plausible crime of genocide against the Palestinians of Gaza, saying we want a long-standing ceasefire, but we have to get rid of Hamas first. So not only did the Speaker allow for this wording to be voted on first, also the wording of the Labour Party's motion took out the point about war crimes that Israel is committing. And there was also another point which was really important, which was that it saved Labour's embarrassment, as many Labour MPs, fearful of their parliamentary seat in the next general elections, were likely to rebel against the Labour Party, who wouldn't have backed the SNP's calls for an immediate ceasefire. It was claimed that the Speaker of the House colluded with and was pressured by Keir Starmer, the man likely to be the next Prime Minister. Labour's vote was passed, and that meant that the SNP, whose day it was to have their motion voted for, didn't even get a vote. And Labour MPs didn't rebel, as they can now claim that they did vote for a ceasefire, even though it had all these conditions to it, which effectively would still give justification for the ongoing slaughter of Palestinians. So it wasn't really a ceasefire. How devious are these politicians? But this wasn't ignored by both the SNP and the Tories, the Conservatives, who initially accused the Speaker of the House of collusion and breaking parliamentary protocol. So their main concern was actually the way that they switched the motion around. That was the problem. Then the Speaker of the House came out. He made the claim he changed the order to protect the very lives of the MPs.
I never, ever want to go through a situation where I pick up a phone to find a friend of whatever side has been murdered by terrorists.
And it's very clear that what the Speaker of the House was trying to do is he was trying to deflect criticism from himself and this idea that he was colluding with Keir Starmer. Who is he protecting the MPs from? Protect the MPs from those effectively Islamist Muslims. This was what was being suggested. Suddenly, the whole narrative changed from the Labour, the Tories and the mainstream media. It all became how Muslims and Islamists threatened the very basis of democratic British society.
A highly political, highly violent ideology called Islamism is sweeping our nation.
Every day, in every way, we cave in to Muslims, to Islamists.
Stories about Muslims seeking to vote in candidates who will support quote-unquote Muslim interests. Robert Jenrick, MP, made this statement.
This House appears cowed by threats of violence and intimidation. We have allowed our streets to be dominated by Islamist extremists.
The mad and crazy Suella Braverman of the Tory party made this statement.
Suella Braverman has weighed in her inimitable style and said Islamists are in charge of Britain now.
Then we had mainstream media questioning why are hate marches being allowed by the Metropolitan Police? Why is a genocidal statement from the river to the sea being projected onto the Houses of Parliament?
Police were accused of standing by and watching from the river to the sea being projected onto Big Ben.
And why are the police so scared of stopping them? Notwithstanding the fact that Netanyahu's party has this statement from the river to the sea firmly embedded in its own charter, but this was still mentioned as though this was something only specific to the Palestinians, and it was a call for a genocide against the Jews. Complete fabrication and lies. Others are saying we've lost control over our streets. And now we see Rishi Sunak claiming that mob rule is replacing democratic rule.
Mob rule is replacing democratic rule. Those are the words of Prime Minister Rishi Sunak as he calls for a more robust police response to intimidation, disruption and subversion.
In response, Keir Starmer said he agreed in substance to what Rishi is proposing, but just not the wording. Just think about this, how dark this has become. The shambles of Parliament has suddenly now become about how mob rule, Muslims and Islamists are running the streets. The police are running scared and will not police properly because of these Muslims and these pro-Palestinian demonstrators. And so what's being proposed by people like Rishi Sunak and some of these MPs? In essence, they want to make it harder to protest. For example, giving a 14-day notice as opposed to the current 6-day notice to have a march or a protest. To ban protests outside of Parliament or MPs' offices and homes. And why these dramatic policies and inflammatory statements? Because of the threat of these Muslims. That's what they're saying.
Islamophobia mania that seems to be gripping everybody.
It's these Muslims that results in these dramatic and draconian measures that we have to make, because they are the very threat. They are threatening the very existence of British democracy and British society and rule of law in this society. And cheered on the media, we then see far-right groups pick up on this and repeat the very words of these mainstream medias.
Everything we've built over the last 1,000 years and more is based on family, nation, and underpinning all of it are Judeo-Christian principles. I mean, they're right through our constitutional settlement and everything else. And we've forgotten that. We're afraid to stand up for that. And now it's that is being crushed. And to see fear stalking the corridors of Westminster in the way that it is a deep international humiliation for our nation.
All this is simply a distraction, a diversion. This is just whipping up hysteria. This is like Salem's witch hunt all over again. It is to deflect criticism. This is what it's about. The political establishment lost control of the narrative on Gaza, and due to pressure from the Zionist lobby and also the fact that Britain sees Israel as a strategic partner for them and the West to control the oil-rich region, they sought to create a bogeyman to scare the wider population, over 60% of whom actually support immediate ceasefire. They want to scare them to back Britain's policy towards supporting Israel. There's no threat to British political society from pro-Palestinian peaceful marches or the Muslim community. I'll give you an example. In 1981, the then Tory government led by Margaret Thatcher was almost wiped out by the IRA. This group had bombed a hotel in which the entire cabinet, the entire government was staying at, and they killed some of these politicians too. Did they call for ceasing protests then? Did they say that marches must be stopped? MP Joe Cox was stabbed to death by a far-right pro-Brexit terrorist. Did they call for the suspension of the Brexit vote or claim that the right wing needs to tone down their rhetoric on immigration? This isn't about physical threat. British MPs have faced that before. This is about controlling the population who have seen the disastrous policies of capitalism in their own lives, like increased economic hardship, and also abroad with a stark naked support for Israel's war crimes and crimes against humanity. This is what happened after 2001 to justify the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, and with Iraq in particular, because there was such opposition in the streets, they sought to demonize Islam and Muslims as an existential threat against the West, to then radicalize the population to support their neo-colonial wars, such as claiming they're attacking us for our freedom, etc. And as for the right, who are currently cheering on banning of marches and protests and pro-Palestinian symbols. So yes, you may call for banning of protests against Gaza now. Make it harder to march for a political cause. Call for banning of non-violent political parties because they happen to be Islamic. But don't start crying when this bites you back in your own backside, and that your marches, these right-wing marches and protests, are called hate marches by the quote-unquote woke left, using the very policies you created. As for the Muslims, we need to expose how the politicians and mainstream media are using the Muslim community as a tool, as a political football in their devious plan to divert people from the real agenda. What's that real agenda? Supporting a murderous genocidal state for their own geopolitical interests in the region. We also need to think that if the so-called mother of all democracies behaves this way, then is this really a system we should appeal to, or a system we should seek to emulate in the Muslim world?